Good morning, party people. Hi, welcome back. I've been on vacation for the last week. Drove up the Pacific Coast Highway and hung out in Malibu for a week. Just we love Malibu, California. It's L.A. County, Ventura County, and it's still pretty open. Like you can't go inside and sit at restaurants, but at least you can go to all the outdoor restaurants. Richie, I did this morning actually. That's why I'm about an hour late. So I drove Helmet for about an hour this morning, so that was a lot of fun. So, yeah, I have the, now I have to go change the settings on it. So I got this little deal where you can hit the remote button and you can open the Targa top from outside. And so you can open it while you're walking up to it. And at first my wife was giving me hell for that. She's like, why would you do that? It's like $500 and it's kind of pointless. You know, you have to get in the car anyway to drive it. And I'm like, yeah, but the whole reason I buy something like a Porsche 911 Targa is so that I can see the top coming back. Like that you can see that big mechanical action and how fancy pants it is. And you can't see it when you're inside. You know, you can't, when you're just hitting inside and hitting the button, you don't get to see it. So having the remote button lets me see it and see the ballet of mechanics as I go up to it. Christopher says, what's your top speed on Helmet? If you choose to divulge such, it would be breaking the law, so I would not say that. But I will say that there's a reason why I have radar and laser defense gear installed in Helmet, and the laser defense stuff worked. Saved me once on this vacation, so that was absolutely excellent. Erica and I were flying along, and all of a sudden, the laser defense stuff starts talking. 4 seconds. She basically has 4 seconds to disarm before she'll jam laser for 4 seconds, and after 4 seconds, she lets lets all laser traffic go through. And so she's like 4 seconds, and Erica was like, "What the hell is that?" I'm like, "Rrr." So it was lots of fun. Kevlar says, how well do the brakes work? Extremely well, just wonderfully well. The brakes are really set up more for the full Porsche 911, like the Carrera S, the higher end models. They don't put much bigger brakes on the higher end models, so the brake is fantastic. The brakes are fantastic, and the engine's fast enough for me. It's not that I wouldn't need anything faster. If it was anything faster, it just would help me lose my license even quicker. So. Early dev, so it doesn't stop the laser, it just delays a bit to let you slow down. So here's the way that it technically works. The way that you're not technically allowed to have a laser jammer, but you can have a laser parking system. And if it detects that it's interfering with police laser, then you have 4 seconds before it disarms itself, because it wouldn't want to break the law. So within 4 seconds, you basically have 4 seconds to drop your speed by whatever miles an hour that you drop it by, and then the jamming stops. So that's technically how the whole trickery gets around there. There's no radar jammers are wildly illegal in California, at least. I don't know how it is in other states, but I wouldn't do a radar jammer. But the laser jammers are kind of neat how they work. They're technically parking systems, so they just shut themselves off when they need to interfere. Exactly. So, and that's how they're sold. They're all sold as laser parking systems, which is kind of funny. So for folks, we'll do an open technical or SQL Server Q&A today. Anything that you want to ask, I would encourage you to ask it over in Twitch. If you want to ask it over in Twitch, then that way it's easier for us to put questions up on queue and go through and answer those. I will answer one of them that happened to come by. One of you asked, how do you get good at SQL Server Management Studio and reporting services? You use them. All right, like, you whatever you use, that's what you get good at. There was a great quote, like 10,000 hours of practice. If you spend 10,000 hours practicing something, you're going to get good at it. And so that's really the point of getting good with something, is just practicing it. Zach says, it's been a while since your last stream. Yeah, I tend to only stream when I have time, like when it works for me. I'm not one of those people who's trying to stream to get famous. It's really something I just do when I'm bored sitting around the house, or when I've got time to give back to y'all. So I'm never going to be like Ninja or Dr. Disrespect, where I'm trying to make a living purely through streaming. This is one of those things that I do, especially with folks in other unusual. Spooner Love asks, is it really true that linked server queries copy the data to the information? Here's the best way to think of it. Linked server queries don't get cached. So if I run a query, me being server A runs a query to go fetch data from the accounting server over on server B, every time you run that linked server query, it goes and fetches the data every single time. Now, how much data does it fetch? It's a dice roll. Sometimes SQL Server is good at reducing the amount of data that it asks for from the opposite server. You kind of think of it as like predicate push down. If you said, show me all the sales from the year 2020, hopefully that filtering happens on the opposite server. It doesn't always, though. So the reason why you're finding mixed information is sometimes it'll filter locally, sometimes it'll filter remotely. To learn more about that, search for Connor Cunningham distributed queries. Connor Cunningham distributed queries. And he has a session at SQL Bits from several years ago where he talked about how you go about tuning linked server queries so that they do process the predicates over on the other side where possible. But sometimes it isn't possible depending on the kinds of joins that you do. Just generally speaking, I'd say if you want to do performance, you avoid linked server queries. That's one of the many reasons why. Mossy Moss, good to see you. Good to see you. All right, let's see here. So we'll start showing some of these queries. Let's see. I'm going to clear off a couple of things here. Who is this? CGS says, what does a control @ sign do in SSMS? Well, why wouldn't you just try it? Moving on. Really? I mean, come on. How the hell am I supposed to know? Next up, Sukhvir says, any advice on understanding data models? E.g., your client has a very complicated data model, either for inserts or selects. How do you approach it? Oh, that's interesting. So you ask for the documentation. Oh, that's right. There's never any documentation. So I don't know about you, but at least at the companies that I go to, people never ever have good documentation. And so I'll ask just, okay, so can you tell me about how these tables are related? Do you have a data model or anything like that? But generally, my own weird world of work in performance tuning, I generally don't have to understand the data model. I usually keep someone next to me from the client where I can ask rapid fire questions to. If I was going to become a full-time employee at a company, you just have to generally start digging through it, but people just don't leave documentation around, sadly. Everybody thinks that their company is the only one that doesn't do documentation. Everybody's like, my company sucks because they don't document things like they're supposed to. Nobody does. Nobody does. Like even our own company. So Richie and I, Joris in here in Twitch, Richie and I mean, we'll document stuff only as necessary in order to build something, but it's fairly rare that we really document everything to the depth to which it really should be documented because it takes time, right? It's expensive. IROC driver, different from Camaro driver, says he had a developer ignore the documentation. You had people not read the documentation? Oh my God, this is kind of the double strike against both writing documentation and people not reading it. Stick around inside here and you'll notice that people don't even Google for basic questions. You know, they just don't even Google anything that they should really be Googling for themselves. And that's half of what these sessions are, is me answering things that you could really go Google for free, but for some reason I think you just want to talk to me, and so here we are. Over on YouTube, Andreas asks, we've experienced lock escalations, but adding an index, the locks disappeared and the seek started happening. Can you explain? It's beyond the course of something I can explain in 10 minutes. I actually do have a module on that in my Mastering Index Tuning class. In Mastering Index Tuning, I talk about the effects that locks have on indexes and indexes have on locks and how you go about tuning those. Just like generally speaking, you aim for around 5 or less indexes per table with around 5 or less columns on each index. The more that you add, the worse your blocking becomes. The less that you have, the worse your blocking becomes. And it's not like there's anything special about the numbers 5 and 5. It's just that I have 5 fingers on this hand and I have 5 fingers on this hand. So it makes it real easy for folks to remember. But we go into the mechanics of it over in my Mastering Index Tuning class. Next up, over on YouTube, Syed says, how do I set up an always-on availability group on my local machine without my AD or a domain? Is it possible? The thing that I would ask is, what's the problem you're trying to solve? You would never want to go into production like that. You wouldn't want to go into production without having some kind of Active Directory security involved on it. So if you're just doing it just for the course of learning, don't do that. Don't try to learn always on availability groups with your local machine. What you probably want to do is build yourself a lab. Next up, Surly Dev, who is heroically copying, pasting things off of YouTube. A round of applause for Surly Dev for making all of this possible. He's a moderator here during the chats. Says, I have SQL Server 2016 Enterprise licensed for 4 cores. Do I need to license 4 more cores for high availability? If you're not covered with software assurance, software assurance is like an annual maintenance fee for SQL Server, and it gets you the ability to run additional replicas for high availability and for disaster recovery. If you don't have software assurance, then yeah, every replica you stand up, every passive node that you stand up is all going to have to be licensed, which blows. Holding LC asks, is there any performance gain in using bitwise columns rather than a multiple bit field, especially with ORs? A bitwise column I've never heard of, and it totally may be out there. I just have never seen it. You're probably going to Google something, and I've probably got a blog post about it. I don't remember anything in terms of a bitwise column. Bitwise searches, yes. I've never had to use those because my thing is, human beings don't usually understand bitwise operators, myself included. Human beings write out things as ORs. Could there be a 1 millisecond performance advantage to using bitwise operators? Maybe, but the thing is, you got to write your code in a way that the next person can understand it. If somebody can't open up your query and immediately take the maintenance workload off of you, then you're probably going to be in for a bad time. Next up, Anil asks, how do I reduce the database size in my data folder? I'd probably start by asking why. What's your goal there? If you're talking about shrinking databases, it's probably a bad idea. What you can do in order to reduce the data file size is to do a database shrink, but the problem that you run into is that causes a couple of different kinds of fragmentation in both external and internal fragmentation inside the data and log files. What I would do is I would re-ask it with whatever the main problem you're trying to solve is. Like, my backups are taking too long, or, what is it? Because after all, none of us are ever bonused on empty space on drives. It's not like I pay Richie by going, hey, Richie, I need you to make sure that there's a terabyte free on every server, then I'll let you make $1 million a year. It just doesn't really work that way. Next up, Pickle Popsicle. How awesome of a name is that? Pickle Popsicle. That's really cool. I was in one of your training sessions and table valued parameters came up, and you seemed to really dislike them. I was hoping to hear more about your bad experiences with TVPs. So the problem with TVPs is that SQL Server doesn't accurately estimate how many rows come out of them. Doesn't matter whether you pass in 1 row or 100,000 rows, SQL Server makes a bad estimate. And if I remember right, it's 50, but don't quote me on that. If I remember right, it's either 1 row or 50 rows. It's something to that effect. So what you generally have to do is, as soon as the stored procedure starts, if the contents of the TVP need accurate estimates, you immediately turn around and dump it into a temp table. So I'm not a big fan of something where I immediately have to dump the contents into a temp table in order to get accurate rows. What I would probably do instead is I would just put it into a temp table. Put the stuff into a temp table, and then when you call the stored procedure, have the temp table already exist, and then you don't have to worry about passing stuff and shredding it into different objects all the time. The place where TVPs make sense is if you have to pass in a bunch of rows from like a C# kind of thing, but otherwise I try to stay away from them because of that nasty estimation problem. Next up, Joe on YouTube asks, what online courses do you recommend for learning SSMS and reporting services? It's been so long. I'm I'm really old. I'm like in my 40s now. I know. And I'm not like on the low side of my 40s either. Don't let the clothes fool you. Somehow all of a sudden now I feel like I'm like a Ken Block wannabe. It's been so long since I've learned either of those, I couldn't really tell you. So I would just Google and go try, and you'll know within a minute of watching that stuff. You shouldn't pay money for those. Those are both so common and they haven't really changed in like a decade, that just go out and Google and you'll find all kinds of stuff on YouTube and it'll all be free. So don't pay money for it. Just if you don't love it in 5 minutes, go get your money back and keep going. Next up over on YouTube, Jens Herman says, we recently had a performance problem with a slim table with lots of data. So here's the thing, never use the term lots or large, because whatever seems large to you may not be large to everybody else. I've heard that from people with like a 50 gig or 100 gig table, and I'm like, it's not really that big. We disabled lock escalation for the table. All the queries dropped under 3 milliseconds response time. Do we have to expect drawbacks? Yes. So imagine that you start nibbling off thousands of rows with an update statement and other queries are coming in at the same time. You could have a real nightmarish hellscape if you run into deadlocks and rollbacks. So that by far and away is the big one. There's also some bit of additional memory consumption. When you say vague stuff like lots of data, which I was going to make a size joke, but it's probably not appropriate. When you say things like lots of data, if it really is a terabyte of data or more, then you can run into memory problems as SQL Server has to allocate memory as it manages all these locks. So the big drawbacks you'll run into are longer rollbacks, higher memory usage, stuff like that. Next up, Willem says, is there a future for SQL Server in a microservices architecture where all the microservices and data are in small data stores? You're right, SQL Server is only good for large database. Wait, what was your question? The hell was your question? Let me rephrase your question. So, is there a future for SQL Server when it costs a lot? And that answer, of course, is going to depend on what your budget is, whether you want to play around with things like SQL Server Express, whether you switch to Azure SQL DB, whatever. You could just as easily say that there's no future for anything that costs money. You know, you could always say for anything that needs to scale out all over the place, if it costs money, is it going to be problematic? But then go try and use some of that free stuff out there and you'll start to learn why there's still a future for a lot of those paid pieces of software. Next up, let's see. Shane says, are there any major differences between using exists instead of in within a subquery? So what you do is just go try, go see, go show the two execution plans, go run them back to back, go look at how they perform differently. And if you want to learn about how to measure queries, go watch my class, Fundamentals of Query Tuning. Another one to watch is Watch Brent Tune Queries. That one's totally free. Go Google for Watch Brent Tune Queries, and I've got several hours of totally free video up there where you can see me comparing two queries against each other, comparing the execution plans, seeing how fast they go, all that kind of thing. Never ever take someone's biblical answer of this feature is always better or this feature is always worse, because there are always edge cases where one of them outperforms the other. Keith says, hey Brent, we see a lot of adaptive joins in the execution plan when we upgrade to 2019. How is adaptive join being executed? So when you have a table that may produce a ton of results or may hardly produce any results at all, SQL Server 2019 can put an adaptive join as the next step inside the query plan, where if that initial table brings back a ton of rows, then SQL Server will do a scan on the next object. If it only brought back a few rows, it'll do a series of seeks on the next object. Now, in terms of like the mechanics of how is it being executed, what I would probably do is just go Google for adaptive joins and go read the manual, because the manual's actually pretty good on some of the newer features like SQL Server 2019 specific features. But if you have a more specific question on what you're trying to accomplish, or be more specific about what it is rather than just how is Babby formed. DBA from Kathmandu says, do you suggest any good resource on availability groups? I would suggest autocorrect. That is such a good question. When availability groups came out in SQL Server 2012, I was like, these are amazing. It's the future. It's going to replace database mirroring. It's phenomenal. But then in every new version that they continued to ship, they kept expanding the feature surface area. They kept giving it more and more capabilities, but they didn't really make it any easier to use. It's actually harder and harder to use with every version. As you start getting into things like distributed availability groups, Kubernetes, the big data clusters availability groups under the hood. So I'm not sure that I've seen, and let me rephrase that. I'm sure I haven't seen any good training material that's kept up with that. For a while there was one blogger who used to write books about availability groups, and he actually sold one, took money for it, and then never actually delivered it because he couldn't keep up. There were so many changes continuously in availability groups, the guy just gave up and never shipped his book. So I don't know that you're going to see a good training class on, or a good book on availability groups. What you probably want to do is, if there's a presenter that you like seeing their stuff on availability groups, contact them with the list of, here are the specific things I want to learn about availability groups, and see if they'll do like a private or a corporate training for you. Yeah, Spooner says the best way to learn about availability groups is work somewhere where someone has a handle on them. And even then, you're going to be really restricted to just the features that they're using. If they're not using distributed availability groups, Linux, things like that, then you're only going to learn portions of them. And that's fine. That's totally okay. Because it's one of those features where if you pour a lot of work learning it, it may not be worth anything to you 6 months or a year from now, because the feature keeps changing like crazy and they keep changing the way that it works. I kind of jokingly said earlier about a feature, go read the documentation. Availability groups are actually one of the things where the only option out there is just reading the documentation. There are a couple people who do training classes, but they just can't cover the whole entire feature inside the span of 3 or 4 days. That's why I gave up availability groups. It was just changing so quickly and the troubleshooting sucked so bad that I was like, I'm kind of staying away from there. Drop table is correct. Ha ha. I'm here for Coding Garden says, when will SQL Server be open source? It's an interesting question, because they've started to open source pieces around it, like Azure Data Studio. They've started to open source like the R and Python integration with it. But really, I would say when it makes more economic sense for Microsoft to open source it. Let's be honest. Y'all aren't doing pull requests for SQL Server. Azure Data Studio is already open source, and you're not doing pull requests for that. When I hear people say, when will it be open source, what they're usually asking is, when will it be free? And it is. SQL Server Express Edition is totally free. You can use it for up to 10 gigs worth of data per database, if I remember right. Your queries go single-threaded, and you only get like 1 gig of RAM. But man, it smokes MySQL. I mean, just at that same data size, it just absolutely smokes stuff like MySQL or Postgres for those small data sizes. Now, when you get larger, that's when you've got to start feeding all kinds of $100 bills into the front. YouTube says, are there better tools available than reporting services? I don't do reporting work, so I wouldn't be able to tell you. I would probably say things like Tableau or Power BI, though. Dinesh says, is it right to define maxstop as the maximum number of child threads created per execution plan operator? I'll show you. So what you do is go to your friendly neighborhood search engine whenever my keyboard starts to recover again, and then go search for Pedro Lopes maxstop. Pedro has a post up there. What is MaxDOP controlling? So this is one way to look at it. That Pedro is a brilliant, wonderful, nice person who works for Microsoft and wrote up a really nice, in-depth, detailed thing there about what MaxDOP controls. Then when you're done reading that, I want to say Paul White had a really good one. Yep, that's the other good one. Search for Paul White and how MaxDOP really works. So between those two, Paul White and Pedro Lopes, those will give you pretty good ideas on how MaxDOP works. Marmon Trout says Qlik is a great BI option to Power BI and Tableau. And it's one of those things where I've heard it as a niche kind of thing. I don't know that it has the market share there. Okay, next up, let's see. DBA from Kathmandu says, can you encrypt the MDF or LDF file? Yes. Next up, Luca says, which exams do I need to take to get MCSE, data management, or analytics? Someone say, oh, it's so terrible. Joe, I wouldn't really ever make that assumption. I wouldn't ever say that one thing is slower or faster than the other, because sometimes it's whether or not you know how to work it. Lucas says, what exams do I need to take? The problem with Microsoft's exams is they keep changing them. They're like a squirrel on cocaine. They're like, this is the future. It's all over here. It's all. Oh wait, no, this is the future. It's all over. Oh, no, Azure. What's the future? It's a Power BI. Is the future. It's kind of just meaningless gibberish. So I would be very careful about investing in a Microsoft certifications when they can't seem to hold focus any better than a 6-year-old with a mouthful of sugar candy. I'm just trying to think of like Pop Rocks. So if you want to find out whatever is needed currently, just go to Microsoft.com, but make sure that as you're architecting out your career plan, hit refresh on the browser a couple of times, because I wouldn't be surprised if Microsoft certification directions changed while you were reading the page. That's how abstract and all over the place these bozos have been. Drop Table Employee says, thank you, Surly Dev, for bringing our friends' dumb questions to Bren's attention. Yes, absolutely, totally fantastic. Joe says, what certification is worth pursuing? I don't think any of them are. I think everything that's out there right now for SQL Server certifications is pretty well garbage. It's pretty well worthless. They really just teach you what the certification vendors want to teach you, and they're just trying to take your money. You're much better off, rather than wasting your time with certifications, you're usually much better off meeting people inside your network, talking to them, and networking, blogging, presenting, etc. That's how to really get your career on track. Don't think that letters on a resume are going to make your resume stand out in a pile. You're still just in the pile. You want to be the person that they want to reach out and grab, maybe not right now because it's, everybody's not washing their hands, but next up, Samson asks, what is the future of reporting services? Will it be taken over by Power BI? A lot of us have asked questions like that over the last 10 years. Since round about SQL Server 2012, reporting services, analysis services, and integration services didn't really seem to have a good future. It wasn't bad. I'm not saying that Microsoft's going to set them on fire, but none of us saw a vision where they're like, okay, we're going to get here in 5 years and we're going to get here in 10 years. It just hasn't seemed to be a clear, linear vision from one place to another. I don't think that I still see that out of Microsoft. It's still very much, if you look behind the curtain, there's a bunch of people working really hard trying to figure things out, but I don't really see a vision there. Next up, Zaki asks, what's the difference between Microsoft Access and SQL Server? It seems kind of unusual that they have two different database applications. Oh, it's way more than that. Azure SQL DB, Managed Instances, Hyperscale, Cosmos DB. I know I'm forgetting like a whole bunch of others involving Power Apps. Access is really good for end users that want to build their own application and they only want to use one tool. They don't want to use a programming language and a database and a server backend. They just want to use one tool and build the whole thing soup to nuts. SQL Server is for when you want to have one central database that hundreds, thousands, or millions of people can access. But when you want to store that data, it's really just like a bastion of defense where you need to avoid any kind of data loss whatsoever. You're worried about things like encryption, stuff like that. So a SQL Server tends to be more for applications that need to scale to hundreds of simultaneous users. Access is really neat for small businesses that can't afford to hire dedicated developers. They just have some people who want to build something, but they don't really want to be developers. You'll also hear people in my line of work, people who are SQL Server people, tend to poop on Access. We do it in a loving, joking kind of way because it actually is a usable application builder for small groups. It's just that by the time you get to hundreds of people, it starts to fall apart. Next up, let's see here. DTovi says, we're switching from Oracle to SQL Server. Software is using the search engine in SQL Server. When you say the search engine, I'm guessing you mean full text. He says, I haven't heard you talk about it. Does performance suck, or is it something that should be using? Some of the columns are TE. I'm assuming you mean text, probably. So full text search works. It just doesn't tend to scale, as opposed to something like Elasticsearch. I'll show you an example. So if I go to stackoverflow.com, and I search for anything up top, and I'm just going to come up with words out of the top of my mind. Tornado, and hit enter. You see how fast that was? 12,142 result, and tornado. I didn't even know there were things with tornado. So 12,000 is a lot, so it's probably cached. Let's try surly dev. It's just surly dev. 0 results. Did you see how fast that was? It's absolutely instantaneous. Let's search for instantaneous. I mean, this is insanely fast. SQL Server's full text, we actually got started with that at Stack Overflow. We started with full text search and had to phase out of it because it just doesn't scale as well as things like Elasticsearch. So if you want to learn more about that, Elasticsearch, the thing that people will next immediately want to ask is, okay, how do I get my SQL Server data into Elasticsearch? That is left as an exercise for the reader. It's because they want to like sit Elasticsearch in between their application and SQL Server, and that's just not how it works. You have to have your application populate Elasticsearch just like you would have your application populate SQL Server, but it's a much faster full text search type engine, scales out, and it's free too, as opposed to SQL Server. Next up, no one says, do you have any advice for working with blob data types? Be more specific. Be more specific about the problem you're facing. Otherwise, it's just kind of like asking me, do you have any advice for data? To which I would respond, yes, and then I would move on. Jesus says, can we do a checkpoint when our TempDB fills up too much? Oh, that's an interesting question. So what a checkpoint's going to do is it's going to force SQL Server to take stuff that's up in memory and go write it to disk. So let's kind of think through that. If my disk was full, should I write more to disk?
10,
let's think about that for a second.
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
I'm going to go with no. Moving on. R. Prakash asks, are there any solutions for analysis services, reporting services, and integration services in Microsoft Azure? For integration services, there is. That's Azure Data Factory. Azure Data Factory is their cloud super scale version of integration services. The people I know who work with Azure Data Factory, so like if you search for Andy Leonard on Twitch, Andy Leonard has a Twitch channel where he talks about how to use Azure Data Factory. And I think there's some kind of lift and shift thing that you can even take some of your SSIS packages and move them up to Azure Data Factory with a relatively limited number of work or limited amount of work. And analysis services, which if you ask Microsoft, they're going to give you a hand-wavy thing like, you should try Azure Synapse Analytics. And see, SQL Dev DBS is the same thing. So this is why you should always be really careful about answering during my webcast, because I might be able to say something that makes you look less intelligent. So I was going to say that the Microsoft people will say things like, you should try Azure Synapse Analytics, in which you should immediately respond with, can I use my application as is, or do I have to rewrite the whole entire thing from scratch? And they're like, we'll give you a great deal on Azure Synapse Analytics, to which you should be throwing a pie in their face. Microsoft just doesn't have a good story for analysis services or reporting services up in the cloud yet, but I have a feeling that they're working there, because a lot of people ask for the same kind of thing that you're asking for. But the answer is no today, unless they give you the hand wavy, you should try brand new ShamWow. Adam says, isn't Azure Synapse just Azure Data Warehouse with a new name and new features? Azure Synapse Analytics is the artist that was formerly known as Azure DW, was formerly known as Azure SQL Data Warehouse, was formerly known as Parallel Data Warehouse, was formerly known as Data Allegro. But I'm sure this is going to be the name that solves all of their problems, and they'll be just fine with this new name. Totally okay. David says, I often want to find the wait events for a query that is run in the past. I use DBA Histack sessions in Oracle. I haven't found something similar in SQL Server. Yeah, so SQL Server doesn't track wait stats for queries unless you go turn on Query Store. If you turn on Query Store, which was new in SQL Server 2016, if I remember right, it has a spectacular amount of drawbacks. It's not something that I want people to turn on by default. You have to know your workload. You have to turn on certain trace flags. So if you want to go know, and it's free, you don't have to pay anything for it at all, but if you want to learn more about it, search for Erin Stellato Query Store. Erin is an instructor over at SQL Skills, and she's got a series of blog posts with best practices, and she's also got a training class over on Pluralsight that teaches you how to turn it on safely, how to use it without it exploding, stuff like that. But that's the piece that you would go and use. All right, next up. Let's see here. Next up, Albert says, thanks, Brent, for providing the fundamentals of index tuning. Really enjoyed that. I'm still wondering why the execution plan was in cache, even though you had run the DBCC free proc cache. Well, you see, Albert, I recorded that video before I went on vacation. And when I went on vacation, I got really drunk, because that's what I like to do on vacation. So if you're asking me why something did the way it did before I got drunk several times ago, I have no idea. I barely remember what I did yesterday, and I didn't even get drunk last night. Much to my dismay. I'm getting drunk tonight, though. Woo! That's what I'm talking about. Farshid asks, they wonder why I can't get a real job. Farshid asks, Brent, is there a best practice about the number of data or log files we can put on the same volume? How do we measure the workload in terms of I/O and compare it with the insight to get about this matter? Are there any workload scripts and performance? Yes, and I teach that in... I have a class. If you go to brentozar.com and then up at the top you click training, in my training classes, I have a class called Mastering Server Tuning, where I teach that exact thing. I teach you how to measure the different bottlenecks inside your server, like storage bottlenecks, weight stats, all that kind of thing. So over there at brentozar.com/training, and then that under the Mastering Server Tuning course. It is, of course, way beyond something that I would want to teach you inside the span of like 30 seconds. But I teach it because that does come up a lot. Let's see, next up we have Avi says, what is the best way to do CI/CD with SQL Server databases? Because I don't do CI/CD, I'm not equipped to tell you what the best way is, but I'll tell you who does. Alex Yates. If you search for Alex Yates, Yates, Alex has a couple of courses, training classes, etc., on CI/CD. There are a lot of free videos that are out on YouTube. So search for Alex Yates and version control, continuous integration. Like, you may want to spell some of those out, just because the search may not work quite as well as we would want. But hit those over on YouTube, and he's got a bunch of videos, totally free, that walk you through, even with demos on how to do it. And he runs a company that does that for a living too, as well. Next up, Lewis said, Brent, you said that when you create tables in a brand new system, you would create only the primary keys. Don't you create indexes on the referencing side of the foreign keys right from the start? I don't usually get to create databases. I'll tell you a secret. I'm not inexpensive. I'm actually fairly expensive. And so people tend to not ask me for advice until it's too late. What happens is they go, hey, Brent, could you give us a help building a brand new application? Sure, my rates are this much. Oh my God, sweet potato. Well, we'll come back to you if we have problems. So then people go and build systems without getting me involved. So because of that, I don't usually get involved in building stuff from the ground up. If I were going to go build a brand new database from the ground up, would I put foreign keys in it? Maybe, but foreign keys are often something that I have to rip out along the way in terms of performance. And if you search for foreign keys on brentozar.com, you'll see why. We have examples of the problems that they cause demoed with the Stack Overflow database. Joe says, how much do you demand per hour? If you have to ask. Next up. Darius says, isn't that terrible? What will be better, a table with millions of rows designed for OLTP, narrow table and joins, or denormalized to avoid joins? Oh, there's a great quote from Joe Selko. Joe Selko is a legend in the database admin community. And Joe said, normalize until it hurts, denormalize until it works. So that normalize until it hurts, denormalize until it works. And you're on the other end of the screen going, Brent, can you just give me an answer, please? If there was just an answer for a question like that, like, well, all of your tables should have 4 columns. If anyone ever gave you an answer like that, you would slap them in the face. Why would I want to give you an answer like that so that then you can slap me in the face? There are a long line of people. You know why I'm up like 30 floors in the building? For safety. Because there are a long line of people down there that already want to slap me in the face. I don't need to give more answers that would cause me to get slapped in the face. So when you hear those kinds of biblical, it's always this, then you can generally guess that it's going to be wrong. Let's see here. Kodo Makoto says, I'm currently using Postgres on NPG SQL. I wonder if I should make a jump into SQL Server. The trick is money. Do you want to make more money, and which one pays better? If I tried to make a lateral jump into Postgres, I wouldn't command very much money because I don't know what I'm doing. Whereas I really know what I'm doing at SQL Server. You know what you're doing at Postgres. You probably don't know what the hell you're doing, but let's just run with it for a second. You know what you're doing with Postgres. So if you know what you're doing in Postgres, you can probably command more money on a Postgres job than you could with a SQL Server job. Now, having said that, if you were starting out with an equal amount of experience across both, generally speaking, when a product costs more, it commands more in terms of a salary. That's why SQL Server people generally make more than MySQL people, and SQL Server people generally make less than Oracle people. Like, Oracle people are sitting in their gold thrones they don't even have monitors. They have people describing to them the contents of what that monitor has. Your Highness, there is a graph on the screen. To the left, there is a gold bar. This represents your wealth. That's what it's like to work as an Oracle person. So if you were thinking about making the switch, the reason why you would do it is money. You just got to watch out for your seniority level, because when anybody starts out, they don't make very much. Next up, Seven Lies says, my company runs an ERP system and apparently doesn't believe in SQL transactions, does its own referential integrity in code. That's not uncommon at all, happens all the time. Often simple things like query timeouts or deadlocks lead to data being inconsistent. Which alcohol do you recommend best to numb the pain? The nice thing is, because your company has an ERP system, you just get the most expensive one you can, because companies with ERP systems have lots of expensive problems. So you can buy very good booze. I don't even have to tell you like what's the best kind of booze you can afford. You don't even have to ask what you can afford. You can just go Google for what's the best kind of whatever, and damn, I mean, money is no object for those of you who have things like SAP, for example. It's fantastic. I have friends of mine who work with SAP. I remember when I was getting started as a consultant, I'm looking at what I'm making and I'm looking at what they're making. And Nathan says, what's the ERP? Enterprise Resource Planning Software, so like SAP. PeopleForce, I think, is another one. Or JD Edwards is another one. So these friends of mine are making like 3 times more than I am, and then I look at what they're having to do for a living, and I'm like, no, I don't really need to make money that bad. Dynamics GP, that's another good one. Hessam says Starbucks. It's great. You can read. Oh, I'm so proud of you. They told me you weren't that bright. I didn't believe them. I said, I bet Hessam can read, and sure enough, you could. It's great. It's fantastic. And you could type. Oh my God, Hessam, that's fantastic. It's so good to see that. Next up, let's see. Sukhvir, good to see you. Haven't seen you. I was going to say I haven't seen you in a while, but it's mostly my fault because I was off doing vacation. Starbucks is expensive. No, it's nothing compared to the one downstairs. Sukhvir says, Constant Care uses Postgres. Have you heard of PG Bouncer or using it? If so, do you know one for SQL Server? Because I couldn't find one on Google. I don't know. I've heard of PG Bouncer, and I've already forgotten if that's a load balancer. Or like a connection pooling type thing. And if so, you don't have to worry about that on SQL Server. SQL Server, I don't mean to imply that SQL Server is better than Postgres. They all do things that are different, but you don't need something to do connection pooling on the SQL Server side. Usually you do connection pooling in your application instead. Like if you're using anything with Entity Framework, Link, and Hibernate, any of those, they do connection pooling already, so you don't have to set it on the SQL Server side. Let's see here. Hernan asks over on YouTube, is there any performance difference between executing a stored procedure 100 times versus creating an XML object? Hernan, yes, there's a very large difference. Generally speaking, I'm not as big of a fan of what you were describing on the second side, as you might have subtly caught up. You're usually better off doing stored procedures. Now, however, I would say too, though, if you're doing stored procedures one at a time and waiting for the response, that's kind of like taking 100 pieces of paper to the copier and feeding them one at a time. If you need to operate on large things or large numbers of rows, you just feed them all in once, like in a temp table, and then process them that way. Kishore says you're the best tutor. You are welcome. Oh, Joe asks, which SQL language has a big future in your opinion? I think just plain SQL, just ANSI SQL. So if you can stay with ANSI SQL, ANSI, ANSI SQL, if you can stay with ANSI, ANSI SQL, you should do pretty well because it's pretty cross-platform, works across, Oracle, MySQL, Postgres, SQL Server. So as databases come on board, they tend to be compatible or with some variation of ANSI SQL, because that's what every report writer and every business analyst in the world knows. They all work with basic SQL. As soon as you start to specialize into either PL SQL, T SQL, whatever, you're just restricting yourself to one particular vendor's implementation, and that's just always a dice roll. You never know when a vendor's going to all of a sudden get distracted and think that something else is the future. I code in T SQL just because I have hitched my horse to to that Microsoft train, and I'm pretty down with it. I don't mind being the last guy in the corner who's working on a mainframe if that's what SQL Server ends up being. If Microsoft got distracted and said that they were discontinuing SQL Server tomorrow, I would ride that donkey to the end of my career, and I would keep beating that dead horse, because it's a pretty awesome horse, even if it's dead. Next up, Farshid says, do you suggest putting fixed length columns before variable length columns? You're reading books that are like 10, 20 years old, and it made sense back 10, 20 years ago when people thought that before they designed an application, they would lay out the tables all on a nice big platform. They would have group discussions and come to a consensus on exactly how everything was going to be designed. Then they would layer the whole thing down in wax like Han Solo and Carbonite, and they would never ever change that. Here in the year, oh my God, it's still 2020. Here in the year 2020, people don't ever design tables and then leave them frozen in Carbonite. They tend to change so much. Like someone from accounting will come running in and go, you forgot the tax column. You know, they're just always adding columns to tables. So I wouldn't sweat over putting the fixed length columns before the variable length columns. If that's your biggest concern in the world, you're doing pretty well. Next up, Avi says, Brent, what's the best resource to learn set-based thinking in order to write SQL queries? I don't know, only because I haven't learned set-based querying in or I haven't learned it in so long ago. I mean, like I learned it 20 years ago, and I don't have a lot of people asking me how to do it today. I feel you. I mean, it's weird and different the first time that you go to do it. The thing I would probably start with, if you go to YouTube, if you search for YouTube Brent Ozar, Doug Lane has built a series of videos for us on our YouTube channel, and I think I still have it on the home page. Yeah, T-SQL Level Up. So if you go to our Brent Ozar Unlimited YouTube channel, Doug has this T-SQL Level Up, and it has a series of videos inside there. No, Abdul, you can't spam inside here. I don't want to see your OnlyFans page. I understand that you're very into animals and what cool things that you can do with them. We're not going to talk about that here, though. All right, so T-SQL Level Up. Aren't I a terrible person? I'm an awful person. I'm going straight to hell. I'm going to take the slow route. Next up, I'm going to skip through a few questions just because I know we've got probably like 30, 40 things in the queue, but I'm only going to do an hour's worth of questions today, and then I'm going to go veg out outside because I can. So let's see here. Let's hit a couple. There's a good one. TJ says, can you briefly explain Optimize for ad hoc? I can. How do I work out whether or not it's good or bad for my workload? So here's the thing. Imagine that you run a pet store, and every time a pet comes in the front door of your pet store, you want to remember that pet. You're like, oh, this is Spot. He likes the chew toys on aisle 3. Oh, this is Sheila. She likes the harnesses on aisle 7, or whatever it is. Well, so what you're trying to do is you're trying to recognize the pets that come in all the time and remember what they like and what aisle you should send them into. Optimize for ad hoc is when every single pet that comes in the front door of the website, every single pet that comes in, is never going to come in again. Like that they're really just all one-offs. In that case, you don't want to bother remembering them. You'll get them to where they need to go in the store, but you're not going to memorize what they look like and their execution plan to get there. So when you turn that switch on, SQL Server does go and build a plan for that pet to get to aisle 7 or aisle 3 or whatever, but it doesn't keep it in memory. Then the second time that they come in, the second time that that pet comes in, SQL Server goes, oh, I've seen you before. I'm going to save your execution plan. So in theory, like the best case scenario is that you're going to save some RAM on not caching execution plans. I have never seen a server where turning that switch on got me any better performance that was enough to get me across the finish line. I mean, like something where it frees up like 1% of RAM. I'm like, golf clap, who really cares? The switch that you're probably interested in instead is forced parameterization. Forced parameterization is a switch that's more useful to the kinds of folks who are doing optimize for ad hoc. I just tend to, if somebody believes that optimize for ad hoc is going to take them across the finish line, I'm like, okay, you go girl, knock yourself out. It didn't make an improvement and you still need okay, cool, let's do this. So I've never told anybody to turn it off, but at the same time, I've also never told anybody, the one thing you need, optimize for ad hoc. Isn't that amazing? You turned it on and all your problems are gone. It's just not that kind of switch. Now, y'all don't have to ask any more questions because there's only like 5 minutes left, and I'm going to pick the existing questions, just cherry pick a few things before we go off and bail. Let's see, I'll pick some of my favorite ones out of here. Oh, Keith says, is the coffee shop in your building that you keep talking about in your stream just a Starbucks? No, the coffee shop in my building doesn't open until 7. And so this Starbucks opens at 6. So I went and got coffee before starting the stream today, but it was good, but not as good as a coffee shop in my building. Next up, let's see. Joe asks a great one. What queries are better, understandable or fast ones? For me, understandable. I will all day, every day, take a query that someone, Eddie, did you not just hear? We're not taking any more questions. I'll try it in interpretive dance. But which queries are better, understandable or fast one? I'll take understandable all day, every day, because if you write understandable queries, at least it's easy enough to pass them off to someone else who can make them fast. I'll tell my developers, I want all people to write understandable queries, and then if it doesn't go fast enough, bring it to me and we'll see how we can make it go quicker. But don't just randomly duct tape 50 things together trying to make it go fast. Make it understandable by a human being, and usually you'll do okay. Tropical Geek says, what state is he in? California, but I think your denial is probably a better answer there. Next up, let's see, we'll do a couple more. Drop Table Employee says, Microsoft sales team last year, Cosmos DB is the solution for all your SQL Server performance problems. It's true, because if you adopt Cosmos DB, you won't have any more performance problems, you'll only have pricing problems. Because the thing was so damn expensive. Now, I'd like to stop for a second, too, and take a shout-out to everyone in the audience here who isn't continuing to type in questions. All of you who aren't continuing to type in questions, give yourself a warm round of applause, because you are officially smarter than the other folks who are attending this webcast. You are fantastic. I would also like to give a shout-out to Surly Dev, who is a heroic, patient human being who helps me survive these webcasts by helping to moderate the question queues. If it wasn't for Surly Dev's help, I would be even more insane than I am now. Last one that I'll go and answer here. WP Legend over on YouTube said, should you configure MaxStop for Standard Edition, seeing as it only allows for 4 cores? You misunderstood something. It's 4 sockets, not 4 cores, but 4 sockets. So it allows up to 4 sockets or 24 cores altogether, so it's quite a bit higher than just 4 cores. And yes, absolutely, you should totally set MaxStop as described in KB article 2806535. I love saying that because I can't believe I'm the kind of person who memorizes knowledge base articles from Microsoft. 2806535 is the one that tells you how to set MaxStop. So thanks everyone for hanging out with me today. And for those of you who I didn't get to your questions, that's cool. You can show up next time. Feel free to hop in next time. And I will be here tomorrow at my kind of off and on regular time tomorrow, like 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. Pacific. And I'll do open Q&A then. And then, but otherwise after that, I'm done for probably a few weeks. I have SQL bits this week, and then I have an emergency after hours client next weekend that I got to go fix their performance issues. So I will see y'all later. Adios, everybody.